Hi there and welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, it's the main event. We're going to talk about simultaneous shifts in supply and demand. Now before this video, there was another one called single shifts. If you haven't watched that one yet, I would definitely recommend going back and watching that one first because it deals with a shift in either supply or demand. In this video, we're going to deal with simultaneous shifts in both supply and demand. So it's going to get a little complicated. So before we get into the shifting stuff, just a couple of reminders again, because these are so important, is only the shifters of demand cause demand to shift and only the shifters of supply cause supply to shift. In other words, you have to remember that a shift in one of the curves does not shift the other curve. So if demand shifts, that doesn't cause a supply shift. If a supply shifts, that does not cause a demand shift. We are looking at both curves shifting simultaneously in this video, but those shifts are the result of simultaneously occurring independent events. In other words, some demand shifter is happening, and at the exact same time, some supply shifter is also happening, but those two things are not related to each other. They're happening independently. So you have to remember that, and if you do remember that, also remember ERDL, increase right, decrease left. As we start shifting more stuff around, it can get really easy to get confused and say, okay, so that one goes to the right when it really should be to the left. So just be very careful about that. And then one final tip is when in doubt, draw it out. So if you get questions about supply and demand shifts and what would happen to the equilibrium price, what would happen to the equilibrium quantity, and you're confused, don't try to do it in your head. Have a piece of paper or a notebook handy so that you can just sketch these kinds of things out, and that will help you get the right answers every time. So with all that in mind, we're going to go through 4 different scenarios here. So scenario 1 is there is an increase in demand, and at the same time, for again, unrelated reasons, there is a decrease in the supply of something. So some demand shifter is increasing demand and some supply shifter is decreasing supply. So what's this going to look like? Again, draw these things out in your notes as we go through this video so you can get it step by step. So we're going to start off with our axes. On the y-axis, we're always going to label that one P for price, and the x-axis is going to be Q for quantity. And we'll start off with our original demand curve, which we're going to be downward sloping, right? Always with demand. And we're going to label that D1. Why D1? Well, there's going to be a D2 coming, right? Because we are going to change demand. And our supply curve is going to be upward sloping. That's going to be S1 because this time we're shifting both of them. So there's D1 and S1. I put them in different colors if that's useful to you. Put them in different colors yourself. If not, let's move on. So from this graph, we get our initial market equilibrium price, which we can put as capital P subscript E1, and our initial equilibrium quantity, which we'll put as Q subscript capital E1. So whenever you're drawing these types of things out, start with this initial graph right here. X marks the spot. You've got your equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. This is the base graph that we're going to start messing around with. So at the very least, you should be very comfortable and very quick at drawing this graph because then we're going to augment some stuff. So first shift we're going to show you is the demand increase. That's an increase, so think to yourself, that's a shift to the right. So increase right, there's our new demand curve. D2. So be sure to get your label straight because if you get lazy about labeling stuff, it's going to be really easy to get lost as to what's the new one and what's the old one and where's the new equilibrium and stuff like that. Now in the previous video, we would have stopped here and would have drawn our new price and equilibrium price and quantity. But there is a simultaneous, that means happening at the same time, shift happening to the supply curve. The supply curve is decreasing, which means it's moving to the left. So don't draw a new equilibrium at this point because we don't know it yet because there's a simultaneous change happening. Demand is increasing and at the exact same time supply is decreasing. But once we've done this, now we can find our new equilibrium price and quantity. So in this situation, you're matching up your subscripts. You've got D2 and S2, right? These are the new ones, so you can match these up. And from that, that's where they cross. X marks the spot. We're going to get an equilibrium price, which we'll call PE2. So the equilibrium price is actually much higher than it was originally, right? Because now you've got less of something, supply shifting to the left, that everybody wants because demand is shifted to the right. So it's rare and popular. That's going to make it very expensive. But here's something that's kind of interesting. If we find the quantity, it looks like the quantity did not change, right? If we draw a line, it's the same quantity. Now, before you're like, oh, okay, so if they shift in opposite directions, quantity won't change. Not so fast. What we're going to say here is that the equilibrium quantity would be indeterminate if demand increases and supply decreases, because we don't know, unless we're told, how much these curves shift by. Now, in the diagram that I did here, supply and demand shifted by the same amounts. I actually made another slide to break this out separately, but at least for right now, note that if demand increases and supply decreases, equilibrium price rises, but we can't say what would happen to EQ quantity. It's indeterminate. So why indeterminate? So let's look. There's what we just did, right? We had demand increase, supply decrease. Except look at this time. In this situation, which shift is bigger, the demand shift or the supply shift? Well, the demand shift is much bigger, right? The supply of this thing decreased by a little bit, but the demand for it increased by a bunch. In this situation, let's see what happened to the equilibrium price and quantity. Price, as again we can predict, is much higher, but look at quantity this time. This time, we can say that the equilibrium quantity actually increased from what it was before. You see that right there? That's an increase in quantity. Now let's look at another graph. Demand increases just like the previous time, only this time it doesn't seem to increase by very much, right? Just increases by a little bit. But supply decreases by a lot, right? So S2 is still to the left, just like it was over here, but now it's really far to the left. In this situation, price is going to be higher than it was, but look what happened to quantity this time. In this situation, the equilibrium quantity actually decreases. So that's why in the previous slide, we said that the quantity would be indeterminate, because unless we know how much each of the two curves shift, we can't say, just given this one increases, this one decreases, we can't say what would happen to quantity. Because again, in this situation, the quantity increased. In this situation on the right, the quantity actually decreased. So what would happen to quantity depends on which shift is bigger, the demand shift or the supply shift. However, do note, we can absolutely say what would happen to the market equilibrium price. There is no situation where demand increases and supply decreases where price doesn't go up. Price is going to go up every single time. All right, so let's take that information and move into scenario 2. This time we're going to see the opposite of what we saw before. We're going to see a demand decrease and at the same time a supply increase. So we're going to start with our graph, price, quantity. There we go. We're building our base graph, right? So there it is. So demand is going to decrease. That's a shift to the left. There it goes. Supply is going to increase. That's a shift to the right. Good. So what happens to the market equilibrium price this time? Well, the equilibrium price is going to go from P1 right here all the way down to here, right? We match up our subscripts 2 and 2. That's our new market equilibrium price. So we can say for sure that the equilibrium price is going to decrease because look at what's happening up here, right? There's a lot more of something that people don't really want that much. That's going to mean the price is going to go down, right? But what can we say about quantity? Well, at this point, you guys should be able to figure this out. Quantity is indeterminate. We can't say for sure unless we know the size of the shifts. In this graph that you're looking at on the screen, quantity happened to stay the same as what it was before, but unless we know the sizes of the shifts, we're going to call it indeterminate. Cannot be determined. All right. Scenario number 3. This time we've got a demand increase and a supply increase. So the curves are shifting in the same direction. Let's start off with our base graph. There we go. Looking good. Great. So demand increase, shift to the right. Supply increase, also shift to the right. So what would happen in this situation? Where is your new equilibrium? Match up your subscripts. Well, this time, quantity definitely increases, right? Because now people want this thing a lot more, but the supply of it's increased. There's a lot more of it. So we know that the market equilibrium quantity is going to be higher than it was before. So that's cool. But what can we say happened to the price? Well, you can probably guess where we're headed here. The equilibrium price would be indeterminate. In this graph that you're looking at on the screen, it stayed the same as it was before, but again, unless you know the sizes of each shift, you can't say it's indeterminate or ambiguous, is something teachers say sometimes for this as well. So that's scenario 3. Scenario 4. Now both curves are going to shift in the same direction again, but this is going to be a decrease in each one. So we've got our base graph right there, supply 1, demand 1, looking good. Equilibrium's there, love it. Practice drawing these things over and over and over again. You'll get really, really good at it, I promise. Now, demand decrease, that's a shift to the left. Supply decrease, that's a shift to the left. Our new market equilibrium quantity is going to be there, which means equilibrium quantity is going to decrease, right? Because now nobody wants this thing and there's not very much of it being supplied, so yeah, much less. But what happens to the price? One more time, say it with me here, it is indeterminate. So that's what would happen. So we've got simultaneous shifts happening in demand and supply. That was a lot to keep track of, so I made this table for you. So in the first column, you can see what the shift is, and then you can see what the result would be for the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So you'll notice a pattern here. When the curves shift in opposite directions of each other, like one increases, one decreases, it's quantity that's the indeterminate thing. When the curves are shifting in the same direction as each other, right, both increasing or both decreasing, it's price that is the indeterminate thing. So that's how to go about trying to remember how these shifts work. But again, this isn't a memorization game. If you can just draw it out every time and just remembering increase right, decrease left, you will be A-okay. So that was how to shift curves simultaneously. It can be a lot to tackle, but if you take it step by step and remember my tips, you're up to the challenge. Thanks for watching.